The morning of March 12, 1945, broke cold and gray over Tinian Island. Captain Robert Fitzgerald stood beneath the massive silver belly of his B-29 superfortress, City of Angels, watching fuel trucks and ordnance crews swarm around the aircraft like worker bees attending their queen. The bomber towered above him, 99 feet of wingspan. For right are 3350 radial engines that could push 141,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs, and men across the Pacific at 350 miles per hour. It was a technological marvel. It was also a complicated beast that could turn on you without warning. "Weather's looking rough over the target," said Lieutenant James Chen, the navigator, approaching with his flight charts rolled under one arm. His breath condensed in the cool dawn air. "Cloud cover at 18,000 feet. We'll be flying instruments most of the way." Fitzgerald nodded, his jaw tight. They'd flown 17 missions together. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. Cities that had become coordinates on a map, smoke columns rising into the stratosphere, flak bursts that looked like black flowers blooming in the sky. Each mission was a roll of the dice. Engine failures. Fighter attacks. Mechanical breakdowns at 25,000 feet where the temperature dropped to 50 below zero and oxygen became more precious than gold. "Loads complete, sir," Sergeant Bill Torres called from the bomb bay. 12 500-pounders. Everything's secure. The rest of the crew gathered beneath the aircraft. 10 men who'd become brothers in aluminum and fire. Lieutenant Paul Henderson, the co-pilot, chewing gum and adjusting his leather flight jacket. Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, the flight engineer, checking engine oil levels one final time. Radio operator Corporal Eddie Russo. Bombardier Lieutenant Tom Hayes. Gunner Sergeants Jackson, O'Brien, Williams, and young Corporal Davis, barely 20 years old, who still wrote letters to his mother every night. They climbed aboard through the forward hatch, moving through the cramped tunnel connecting the pressurized compartments. The interior smelled of hydraulic fluid, metal, and the faint residue of burnt gunpowder from previous missions. Fitzgerald settled into the left seat, his hands moving through the pre-flight checklist with practiced precision. Switches, gauges, instruments, each one a potential lifeline or death sentence. "Radio check," Fitzgerald said into his throat mic. "Tower, this is City of Angels. Radio check," Russo called from his station behind the cockpit. "City of Angels. Tower reads you 5 by 5. You're cleared for engine start." The four right are 3350s coughed to life one by one, their 18 cylinders roaring with a sound that rattled your bones. Blue smoke poured from the exhausts before clearing. The propellers became invisible discs of spinning metal. Fitzgerald felt the aircraft come alive beneath him, vibration traveling through the control column, through the rudder pedals beneath his feet, through every rivet and seam. They taxied to the runway, the bomber swaying slightly on its tricycle landing gear. Ahead, the coral runway stretched 8,500 feet toward the ocean. 34 other B-29s from the 73rd Bombardment Wing were forming up, their silver fuselages gleaming in the weak morning light. Tower, City of Angels ready for takeoff. City of Angels, you're cleared. Godspeed. Fitzgerald pushed the throttles forward. The four engines screamed, propellers clawing at the dense tropical air. The bomber accelerated slowly, reluctantly, like a fat man trying to run. 60 miles per hour. 80. 100. The nose wheel lifted. 120. The main gear broke free from the earth and they were airborne, climbing slowly, the weight of fuel and bombs fighting every foot of altitude. They joined the formation, tucking into the protective box with other B-29s. 300 miles to the target, a radar installation and communications facility near Kobe. 300 miles back. 6 hours in the air. 6 hours where anything could go wrong. At 18,000 feet, they leveled off and Fitzgerald engaged the autopilot. The formation tightened, each bomber maintaining precise spacing. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a wrinkled gray blanket. "Radio check with the formation," Fitzgerald ordered. Russo keyed his mic. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. "Sir, I'm not getting any response from the formation. Let me check the equipment." He flipped switches, tested connections. "Radio's dead, Captain. Transmitter and receiver both." Fitzgerald exchanged a glance with Henderson. Flying without radio contact was dangerous but manageable. They could follow the formation visually. But a bad feeling settled in his stomach. Then, 30 minutes into the flight, it happened. Fitzgerald touched the rudder pedals, making a minor course correction. The aircraft didn't respond. He pressed harder. Nothing. The rudder was completely frozen in a slight right deflection. "Paul, you feel that?" Henderson put his feet on the rudder pedals. "Rudder's jammed." Fitzgerald's hands tightened on the control column. A jammed rudder meant they couldn't coordinate turns properly. It meant fighting the aircraft every second. It meant that landing, already the most dangerous part of any B-29 mission, had just become exponentially more deadly. "Bill," Fitzgerald called over the intercom. "Get back to the tail section. Check the rudder cables and control surfaces." Kowalski unstrapped and moved aft through the unpressurized rear compartment, wearing his oxygen mask. Minutes passed. Each one felt like an hour. "Captain," Kowalski's voice crackled over the intercom. "The rudder linkage is seized solid. Looks like a hydraulic line failure. The control surface is stuck at about 10 degrees right. I can't free it manually." Fitzgerald felt sweat forming beneath his flight cap despite the freezing cockpit temperature. No radio. Jammed rudder. They were 300 miles from Tinian, deep over enemy waters, in a crippled aircraft that wanted to turn right like a shopping cart with a bad wheel. Henderson looked at him. "What do you want to do?" The formation continued ahead, unaware that City of Angels was fighting for its life. Fitzgerald made his decision. "We're aborting the mission. We can't bomb like this, and we can't defend ourselves properly. We're going home." He banked the bomber left, fighting the jammed rudder with aileron and throttle adjustments, coaxing the aircraft into a slow, painful turn. The formation continued without them, growing smaller against the gray sky. City of Angels was alone now. 300 miles from safety. No radio. A rudder that wanted to kill them. The real fight had just begun. The B-29 wallowed through the sky like a wounded whale, every movement requiring constant correction. Fitzgerald's arms ached from fighting the control column. The aircraft wanted to turn right, the jammed rudder constantly pushing the nose off course. He compensated with left aileron and asymmetric throttle, reducing power on engines 1 and 2 while maintaining it on 3 and 4. It was like steering a car by manipulating only the gas pedal and parking brake. "Airspeed's bleeding off," Henderson warned. "We're down to 210. "I know. Can't help it. If I push harder, we'll turn even worse." Chen emerged from the navigator's compartment, his face pale. "Captain, I've calculated our fuel consumption at this throttle setting and airspeed. We've got enough to make Tinian with about 30 minutes reserve, if nothing else goes wrong." "And if something does?" "Then we swim." The Pacific stretched endlessly below them, cold and gray and indifferent. A B-29 crew could survive a water ditching if everything went perfectly. If the belly didn't break open, if they had time to deploy the life rafts, if the sharks and exposure didn't get them first. But survival rates for ditched bombers were less than 50%. Most crews simply vanished, their remains scattered across thousands of square miles of ocean. "All right, listen up," Fitzgerald said over the intercom. "We've got a jammed rudder and no radio. That means when we reach Tinian, we can't tell the tower we're in distress. They won't know to clear the airspace. They won't know we need priority landing. They won't know we're coming in on one prayer and a hydraulic failure." Silence on the intercom. Then Davis, the youngest gunner, spoke up. "So what do we do, sir?" "We fly this aircraft home. We fight it every inch of the way. And when we get there, we put it on the ground in one piece." "Yes, sir." But first they had to survive the next 3 hours. The first hour was manageable. Fitzgerald and Henderson worked in tandem, switching control every 15 minutes to rest their arms. The physical effort of keeping the bomber on course was exhausting. Every muscle in Fitzgerald's shoulders and back burned with fatigue. His hands cramped around the control column. Kowalski moved between the flight deck and the engine stations, monitoring temperatures and pressures. "Number 3 engines running hot," he reported. "Oil temperatures in the yellow." "Can we cool it down?" "Not without reducing power, and we need that engine to counteract the rudder." "Then we live with it. Keep watching it." The second hour brought weather. The clouds that Chen had predicted materialized as a wall of gray cumulus stretching from 10,000 feet to over 20,000. They had no choice but to fly through it. The B-29 entered the storm like a ship entering fog. Visibility dropped to 0. Rain hammered the windscreen. Turbulence shook the aircraft, sudden drops and climbs that made Fitzgerald's stomach lurch. Lightning flashed, turning the clouds electric white for brief, blinding moments. St. Elmo's fire danced along the propeller tips and the leading edges of the wings, eerie blue flames that looked supernatural. "Altitudes all over the place," Henderson shouted over the roar of the storm. "We're dropping 16,000, 15,500. Fitzgerald pulled back on the column, fighting to maintain altitude while the jammed rudder tried to throw them into a spiral. The aircraft shuddered, metal groaning. Rain found every seam and leak, water dripping from overhead panels onto the instruments. "Airspeed," Henderson called. "We're too slow, 190, 185, we're approaching stall." Fitzgerald pushed the throttles forward, feeling the engines surge. The airspeed needle climbed reluctantly. But the aircraft turned harder right. He had to correct with even more aileron, the control surfaces at their limit. A massive updraft caught them, throwing City of Angels upward 500 feet in seconds. Then a downdraft slammed them back down. Equipment broke loose in the back, someone's canteen, a toolbox, something heavy that crashed and rolled. A gunner cried out, "Someone's hurt back there." O'Brien's voice crackled over the intercom. "Deal with it," Fitzgerald snapped. He couldn't afford distraction. Every second in the storm was testing the aircraft's structural limits. The wings flexed and bent, metal screaming. Rain turned to hail, pelting the fuselage like machine gun fire. Then, as suddenly as they'd entered it, they burst out of the storm. Clear sky opened ahead. The ocean was visible again, choppy and white-capped but real and solid. "Damage report," Fitzgerald ordered. Reports came in one by one. Williams had been thrown against a bulkhead and had a possible broken rib. Superficial damage to the tail section. Number 3 engine still running hot but within tolerances. Fuel consumption higher than calculated due to the throttle adjustments in the storm. "Chen, recalculate our fuel situation." The navigator worked his numbers. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "We've burned more fuel than anticipated. We're going to arrive at Tinian with less than 15 minutes of reserve. Maybe less. Meaning we get one chance to land. No go-arounds. No missed approaches. We put it down the first time or we don't make it." Henderson let out a slow breath. "And we can't tell anyone we're coming." The third hour was the longest. Fitzgerald's arms felt like lead. His vision blurred from fatigue. But they kept flying, mile after mile, fighting the aircraft every moment. "Land ho," Chen finally called. "Tinian, dead ahead. 15 miles." Through the haze, the island emerged, a dark speck against the ocean, growing slowly larger. The runways were visible now, long coral strips carved into the jungle. Other B-29s were landing and taking off, a continuous stream of traffic. Fitzgerald keyed his intercom. "All right, everybody strap in tight. This is going to be rough. We have no radio, so we can't tell the tower we're in distress. We can't wave off other aircraft. We're going straight in and putting this machine on the ground." "Sir," Russo said, "without radio, how will they know to clear the pattern?" "They won't. We just have to hope we don't run into anyone." He began the descent, dropping the massive bomber toward the island. 10,000 feet. 8,000. 5,000. The jammed rudder made every maneuver a battle. He had to plan every turn minutes in advance, calculating how much the aircraft would fight him, how much altitude he'd lose making the correction. "Gear down," he ordered. Henderson pulled the landing gear lever. 3 green lights illuminated. Gear down and locked. Flaps to approach. The flaps extended with a hydraulic whine. The aircraft slowed, became heavier, more reluctant to turn. They were on final approach now, lined up with the runway. But another B-29 was also on final, slightly ahead and to their right, completely unaware that City of Angels was there. "He doesn't see us," Henderson said quietly. Fitzgerald's hands were locked on the controls. Sweat ran down his face. The other B-29 was seconds from touchdown. If they didn't land now, they wouldn't have enough fuel to go around again. He made his choice. Full flaps. "We're going in." The runway rushed up at them, 8,500 feet of crushed coral that looked impossibly narrow from the cockpit. The other B-29 was touching down ahead of them, its main gear kissing the runway with puffs of smoke. City of Angels was descending on the same approach path, seconds behind, with no way to communicate, no way to wave off, and a jammed rudder that wanted to kill them on the most critical phase of flight. "He's clearing the runway," Henderson said, his voice tight. "Turning off at the taxiway. Not fast enough." The other bomber was rolling, slowing, but still occupying precious runway space. Fitzgerald had a split-second decision to make. Abort the landing and attempt to go around with critically low fuel and a crippled control system, or continue the approach and hope, pray, that the runway cleared in time. His hands didn't waver on the controls. "We're committed." Full flaps. The flaps extended to their maximum deflection. The B-29 dropped like a brick, the nose pitching down. Fitzgerald pulled back on the control column, using elevator trim to maintain approach angle while simultaneously fighting the jammed rudder with maximum left aileron. The aircraft was essentially flying sideways, crabbed into the wind, the nose pointing 5 degrees left of the runway centerline while the fuselage tracked straight ahead. "Airspeed 135, Henderson called. 130. You're right on the edge, Bob." The stall warning horn blared, a shrill, angry shriek that meant the wings were about to stop producing lift. Too slow and they'd fall from the sky. Too fast and they'd overshoot the runway. Fitzgerald held the airspeed exactly where it needed to be, in that razor-thin margin between flying and falling. Other aircrafts clear. Runways open. The coral surface rushed up, filling the windscreen. Fitzgerald could see every crack, every imperfection, every stone. The massive bomber crossed the runway threshold at 110 miles per hour, the 4 engines howling, control surfaces at their limits. "Cut power," he ordered. Henderson pulled the throttles to idle. The engines wound down with a dying scream. The main gear struck the coral with bone-jarring force, a violent collision between 65 tons of aircraft and the unforgiving earth. The entire airframe shuddered. Metal groaned. The tires screamed as they absorbed the impact. But they were down. The nose wheel settled onto the runway with a second, lighter impact. They were rolling, decelerating, but the jammed rudder still wanted to turn them right. At 60 miles per hour, it started to happen. "We're veering," Henderson shouted. The bomber's nose swung right, pulling them off the runway centerline. Toward the jungle. Toward the parked aircraft. Toward disaster. Fitzgerald stood on the left brake pedal with all his weight, simultaneously adding power to engines 1 and 2 while keeping 3 and 4 at idle. It was desperate, violent, asymmetric braking that threatened to collapse the landing gear or blow the tires. The aircraft shuddered, skidding, the right main gear smoking. The runway edge approached, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. Trees and equipment were dead ahead. "Come on, you bastard," Fitzgerald growled through clenched teeth. "Turn! Turn!" The differential braking and asymmetric thrust finally overcame the jammed rudder. The nose swung left. They straightened. The bomber slowed, the deceleration throwing everyone forward against their harnesses. 40 miles per hour. 30. 20. 10. City of Angels rolled to a stop 200 feet from the end of the runway, the engines winding down to silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the tick of cooling metal and the gasping breath of 10 men who just cheated death. "Fuel state?" Fitzgerald finally asked, his voice hoarse. Kowalski checked the gauges. "We've got 12 minutes of fuel left in the tanks." "Maybe." 12 minutes. They'd landed with 12 minutes to spare. If they'd attempted a go-around, they would have run dry somewhere over the ocean. The tower was calling on the radio, frantic transmissions demanding to know who just landed without clearance, without radio contact, without following any established procedure. But the radio was still dead. Russo couldn't answer. "We need to get off this runway," Henderson said. "There are aircraft stacked up behind us." They restarted one engine and used it to taxi clear, the bomber lurching and fighting even at taxi speed with the jammed rudder. Ground crews ran toward them, vehicles with flashing lights converging on their position. When they finally shut down all systems and opened the hatches, the tropical air hit them like a warm, wet blanket. Fitzgerald climbed down from the cockpit, his legs shaking so badly he nearly fell. His hands were cramping, locked into claws from gripping the controls for 3 hours straight. An operations officer and a maintenance colonel were waiting. "Captain, what the hell just happened up there? You landed without radio contact, without clearance, nearly collided with another aircraft." "Colonel," Fitzgerald interrupted, his voice flat and exhausted, "we flew 300 miles with a jammed rudder and no radio. We couldn't communicate. We couldn't turn properly. We barely had enough fuel to make it home. That landing was the only landing we were going to get." The colonel's anger evaporated. He stared at the B-29, at the crew members climbing out, at the maintenance teams already swarming over the tail section. "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. "You flew it all the way back like that?" "We didn't have much choice, sir." The maintenance crew found the problem within minutes, a fractured hydraulic line that had dumped all fluid from the rudder control system. The linkage had seized completely. The flight engineer who examined it shook his head in disbelief. "Sir, I don't know how you landed this aircraft. The rudder was locked solid. You should have lost control on final approach. You should have ground looped. You should have—" He stopped. "You shouldn't be standing here talking to me." That night, in the officers' club, Fitzgerald sat with his crew. They didn't talk much. Davis was getting his ribs taped up. Kowalski was drinking straight whiskey. Chen was working on his mission report, trying to explain in official language what couldn't be explained, how they defied physics and probability and common sense. "We're grounded for 3 days while they repair the hydraulics," Henderson said. 3 days of not dying. 3 days until the next mission," O'Brien corrected. "Then we do it all over again." Williams raised his glass. "To City of Angels. The bomber that wouldn't quit." They all drank to that. To the aircraft. To the machinery. To survival. But Fitzgerald stared into his own glass and saw the runway rushing up at him, the jammed rudder pulling them toward the trees, the fuel gauge dropping toward empty. 300 miles. A jammed rudder. No radio. They'd made it home. But tomorrow there would be another mission. Another roll of the dice. And eventually, the odds always caught up with you. The sun set over Tinian in bands of orange and purple, painting the B-29s on the flight line in colors that looked almost peaceful. Almost beautiful. Fitzgerald stood alone near City of Angels, watching maintenance crews work under portable lights to replace the entire rudder control system. The damaged hydraulic lines lay on the coral like dead snakes, the metal fractured in 3 places. The maintenance officer walked over, wiping grease from his hands. "Captain, I've been working on B-29s since they came off the line in Wichita. I've seen hydraulic failures. I've seen control surface problems. But I've never seen anyone fly one home with a rudder this badly jammed." He gestured at the aircraft. "The control forces you must have fought. You should have lost it. The math says you should have lost it. The math didn't account for how much we wanted to live." The officer nodded slowly. "Your crew's talking about what happened up there. Word spreading through the wing. Some of the boys are calling it the impossible landing. Others are just calling it luck. It wasn't luck. No, sir. I don't believe it was." Fitzgerald walked the length of the bomber, running his hand along the riveted aluminum skin. Every dent, every oil stain, every patch of scorched metal told a story. This aircraft had carried them to Tokyo and back. To Osaka through flak so thick you could walk on it. To Nagoya through fighter attacks that left holes you could stick your fist through. And today, crippled and wounded, it had carried them home one last time. But at what cost? Back in the barracks, he found Chen sitting on his bunk, staring at a letter. The navigator looked up, his eyes red. "Got word from back home. My brother's squadron. B-24s over Germany. They went down over Bremen 3 weeks ago. No survivors." Fitzgerald sat down heavily on his own bunk. There were no words. What could you say? That they were the lucky ones? That they'd somehow earned the right to survive while others didn't? The weight of it pressed down on him, not just today's flight, but every flight, every mission, every crew that didn't make it back. "We did 28 missions together," Chen said quietly. "Him and his crew. 28 times they took off and came back. Then on the 29th. He folded the letter carefully. "Why them? Why not us? I don't know, James. I honestly don't know." The door opened and Henderson walked in, followed by several other pilots from the squadron. Captain Miller, Lieutenant Foster, Major Carson, the squadron commander. "We heard what happened," Carson said. "Jammed rudder, no radio, flying on fumes. Hell of a piece of flying, Bob. Just brought my crew home, sir. It was more than that, and you know it." Carson sat down on the footlocker. "I've been in this war since '42. I've seen good pilots. I've seen great pilots. I've seen pilots do things that shouldn't be possible. What you did today." He paused. "The colonel's putting you and your crew in for commendations. Maybe more." Fitzgerald shook his head. "We don't need medals. We need reliable aircraft. We need maintenance that can catch hydraulic failures before they happen. We need crews like yours," Carson interrupted. "Because the aircraft will fail. The equipment will break. The missions will keep coming. And when everything goes wrong at 18,000 feet over the Pacific, we need men who don't quit. Men who bring it home." After they left, Henderson sat down next to Fitzgerald. "You okay? Define okay." "Fair point." Henderson pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a long drag. I was scared today, Bob. Really scared. When that rudder locked up and we had no radio. For a while there, I thought we were dead men. I thought about ditching. I thought about bailing out. I thought about all the ways it could end. But it didn't end. No. Because you wouldn't let it. Henderson looked at him. How do you do it? How do you keep flying when you know the odds? When you know that eventually, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, the luck runs out. Fitzgerald was quiet for a long time. Outside, another B-29 was taking off for a night mission, its engines roaring into the darkness. I don't think about the odds, he finally said. I think about the crew. I think about getting Davis home to his mother. Getting you home to your wife. Getting Chen home to his family. That's all that matters. Not the missions. Not the targets. Not the war. Just the men in that aircraft. 2 weeks later, City of Angels flew its 19th mission. Then its 20th. Then its 21st. Each time, the crew climbed aboard knowing that the odds were stacking higher against them. B-29 losses over Japan were mounting. 14% of crews didn't complete their tour. Some went down over the target. Some ditched in the Pacific and were never found. Some limped home damaged and crashed on landing. But City of Angels kept flying. On April 7, 1945, they bombed the Nakajima aircraft factory near Tokyo. On April 13, they hit the Kawasaki Steel Works. On April 27, they flew through a fighter attack that killed their tail gunner and left holes through both wings. They made it home. The hydraulic failure, the jammed rudder, became legendary in the 73rd Bombardment Wing. New crews heard the story. Maintenance crews used it as an example of what could go wrong and how good pilots could overcome it. But for Fitzgerald and his men, it was just another day. Another mission. Another time they'd looked death in the face and said, "Not today." Years later, long after the war ended, Fitzgerald would be asked what he remembered most about that flight. About the 300 miles with a jammed rudder and no radio. About the impossible landing. About defying the math and the odds and probability itself. He would think about it for a long time before answering. "I remember being tired," he'd say. "I remember my arms hurting from fighting the controls. I remember Henderson watching the fuel gauge and not saying what we both knew, that we were cutting it too close. I remember seeing the runway and thinking, this is it. Either we make it or we don't. But mostly I remember the silence after we landed. That moment when the engines wound down and we just sat there, not quite believing we'd made it. 10 men who should have died. 10 men who didn't. That silence was heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. Because it meant we'd live to fly again. And that terrified me more than the jammed rudder ever did." The B-29 City of Angels completed 32 missions before the war ended. It brought its crew home 32 times. After the war, it was scrapped, cut apart for aluminum, its pieces scattered to the winds. But the story survived. The story of the day a crew refused to quit. The day they flew 300 miles with a jammed rudder and no radio and landed an aircraft that shouldn't have been landable. The story survived because it needed to. Because sometimes, in war, the only thing that separates survival from death is the refusal to accept the impossible. The stubborn insistence that you can bring it home. The belief that when everything breaks, when all the systems fail, when the odds say you're finished, you still have your hands on the controls. You still have your crew beside you. You still have one chance. And sometimes, against all logic and reason and probability, one chance is enough. The sun set over Tinian every night after that mission, painting the B-29s in colors of fire. And every night, somewhere on that island, a crew was preparing for tomorrow's mission. Preparing to take off into uncertainty. Preparing to face whatever the war threw at them. Because that was the job. That was the war. That was what you did. You flew the mission. You fought the machine. You brought your people home. And when the impossible happened, when fate and physics and probability all stacked against you, you didn't calculate the odds. You just kept flying.